The Widow of Whale Bay, Mary Wallace and the Ships That Never Came, 1852. New Zealand. The Widow of Whale Bay. The sea at Whale Bay was not known for its drama. Unlike the tempestuous Tasman storms that battered nearby coves, the waters here crept in with almost ceremonial stillness. If you had wandered along the curved beach in the winter of 1852, your boots sinking into damp sand, you might have seen her, a small angular woman dressed in faded black, standing by the rocks just after dawn. She faced the sea every morning without fail. Her name was Mary Wallace. Asterisk at a glance. Mary's life may have seemed like many others on the New Zealand coast during the mid-19th century. Her husband, Edward Wallace, had been a shipwright and sailor, one of the many Englishmen who arrived, chasing both adventure and lumber in the wake of New Zealand's colonial expansion. The two of them settled near Whale Bay, where Edward constructed a modest home out of kauri wood and local stone. It was a lonely place then, the nearest neighbor 2 hours away by horseback. But to Mary, who had grown up in the noise of Bristol's docks, the silence was a welcome relief. Asterisk, their home became a signal station, of sorts. With Edward frequently away at sea, Mary took on the habit of watching for ships. By 1850, the bay was expected to become a small but useful harbor for timber traders. Several ships had been promised, each contracted to deliver tools, mail, and most importantly, building supplies to turn the trail into a port town. Mary kept the register of arrivals in a narrow leather-bound ledger, a gift from a Royal Navy officer who passed through and admired her diligence. She also logged weather patterns, wave heights, and the shape of the clouds. For Edward, she always said, he needs to know what waits for him ashore. But Edward never returned. His last letter, dated July 1851, was brief. He wrote that he would sail from Sydney with a small convoy carrying saw blades, barrels, and spices. "We'll be back before the gorse blooms," he promised. Mary pinned the letter above their fireplace. Gorse bloomed in spring. By December, her ledger's ship columns remained empty. New Zealand in 1852 was on the cusp of change. Settlements inland were growing rapidly. Wanganui, Dunedin, and Christchurch were evolving from scattered sheep pens into formalized towns. The Treaty of Waitangi was still a fresh wound for many Mbori-Iwai. But on the coastlines, especially in places like Whale Bay, people lived caught between two tides: old promises of trade and the slow erosion of interest from colonial planners. What had once been charted as a vital port had quietly slipped from maps as priorities changed. Asterisk, and so Mary remained. Asterisk, she cleaned and oiled Edward's tools, keeping his workshop ready for his return. She mended nets that would never be thrown. But her most consistent act was walking to the point just before sunrise, scanning the waterline with a brass spyglass, and waiting. She documented every flicker of motion, every gull's shadow, every smudge of mist that might be mistaken for sails. Locals began calling her the Widow of Whale Bay, though no death had ever been confirmed. Mary never used the word widow herself. "He is delayed," she would say, with quiet precision. Asterisk, by the fall of that year, officials stopped sending mail to the Wallace homestead. When a postal agent visited to inform her that delivery services had been rerouted inland, Mary responded by building a mailbox of her own, a tall, weathered pole with a tin flag that she raised whenever she sent a letter by passing tradesmen. To whom she wrote, no one was quite sure. The letters were sealed and marked with careful script, "For Captain Edward Wallace, on any vessel eastward bound." Asterisk, the landscape around her shifted. Trees were cleared for sheep stations. Maori families who had lived along the coast for generations began moving further inland, seeking better trade with settlers who respected their mana. The bay grew quieter. One season, a surveyor arrived with the intent of demolishing the remaining wharf. Mary stood in his way, silent and immovable. The wharf was left untouched. No further attempts were made. Sometimes, children from nearby villages would sneak onto her land to watch her at the shore. They whispered stories that she had salt water in her blood, that she spoke to whales, that she knew when a ship would sink just by feeling the wind. In truth, Mary was simply consistent. In a time of shifting maps and collapsing promises, she represented something rare, someone who believed entirely in a return. But by the start of 1853, her entries in the ledger began to change. Fewer. Weather notes, no sightings. On the 4th of January, she wrote only 2 words. Nothing arrived. On the 15th, still nothing. Then a week with no writing at all. What had Mary seen that winter? Did a storm in the distance match one from Edward's old letters? Did a rumor reach her that his ship was sighted elsewhere, or worse, never at all? The ledger does not say. But the shift in her entries, from hopeful detail to silent absences, marked a quiet change in the rhythm of her waiting. And yet she remained. Even as others left Whale Bay for new towns and trade routes. Mary Wallace stayed. Not as a recluse, but as a living question. A woman who watched the sea, not for beauty, not for weather, but for something long promised and never delivered. She had become, perhaps without meaning to, part of the coastline itself. But what happens to a shoreline when its ships never return? The ships that never came. You might wonder why no one ever gave Mary Wallace a definitive answer. Why did no letter come from a port authority? Why no naval notice, no shipping report to bring closure? The answer lies buried in the slow, clumsy record-keeping of 1850s maritime bureaucracy. Ships, especially merchant ones, were often lost without trace, and more often still, they were simply rerouted, repurposed, or merged into larger convoys without proper notification. A ship like Edward Wallace's, likely unnamed, undocumented, operating under secondary charters, could vanish from public knowledge without so much as a footnote. By 1853, several other families who had once waited for cargo along New Zealand's sparsely mapped western coast had given up. A shortage of timber deliveries halted shipbuilding in smaller ports, shifting trade further south. Settlers abandoned incomplete homes. Some returned to England. Others moved toward Auckland or Nelson. The vision of a thriving port at Whale Bay was quietly erased in colonial council reports, replaced with more practical notes about marsh conditions and low yield potential. But Mary kept her register. When the weather permitted, she walked the coastline twice daily. The sea gave her no answers, but neither did it ask anything of her. It was constant, even when everything else seemed to change. That year, she built a second structure, a small shed just past the edge of the bluff. Inside it, she stored her growing collection of logs, notes, and sketches of ships seen over the horizon. A small tide chart was hand-carved into the wall, with pegs she moved daily. The local children called it the watch house, though no one was ever invited inside. Except once. In late March 1854, a man arrived in Whale Bay. His name was Joseph Fenwick, a flax trader from Taranaki who had heard of the widow with the ledger. He had traveled partway by sea, partway on horseback, and claimed to have sailed once with a man named Wallace. Mary allowed him into the watch house. No one knows what was said inside, but after he left, she wrote in her ledger, "He spoke kindly, but it is not the same Wallace." Around this time, Mary began placing signal fires along the headland. Each evening she lit 3, one by the watch house, one on the North Rock, and one at the high bluff. These fires, visible from several nautical miles out, served no official purpose. But sailors passing the coast began recording them in their logs. 3 lights near Whale Bay, no settlement seen. They began appearing in maritime charts as a curiosity. Some captains, thinking them a navigational aid, rerouted through the bay for bearings. None of them brought Edward. In her solitude, Mary Wallace became an unintentional lighthouse keeper. Not officially listed, not paid or acknowledged, but her presence and her fires became part of the maritime rhythm along that stretch of New Zealand coast. When storms came, her lights were the only thing guiding small crafts to safety. Fishermen who had once laughed at the mad widow now came quietly, leaving small gifts, fish, bread, or oil, at her steps. They never spoke much. Mary never asked them to. But still, no word of Edward. In a small coastal paper, printed in Wanganui in 1855. A single column appeared in the local notices. To any who remember Captain Edward Wallace, last seen departing Sydney July 1851 aboard the Altona, his wife remains stationed in Whale Bay. No record of ship or crew has surfaced. Any information welcome. The Altona. It was the first time the ship had been named publicly. That name helped a little. In early 1856, a retired signalmaster in Port Jackson recalled the Altona docking briefly, taking on 2 unregistered passengers, and sailing out toward New Caledonia. Others claimed it had changed its name mid-voyage, a common tactic for trade ships avoiding customs taxes, and may have continued under a different flag, but none of the leads proved definitive. There were too many ships, too few records, too many seas. That same year, Mary wrote in her ledger, "Today the wind came from the east. I dreamed of foghorns, but they were distant." Dreams were rarely mentioned in her entries, and yet they began to appear more frequently. In July, he was wearing his blue coat. He said he could not find the shoreline. In September, a vessel without sails passed in silence. The water did not move. She never described these as hallucinations or visions, just entries. Observations in her way. By 1857, the government formally removed Whale Bay from future port development. A road that had been planned to reach the bay was canceled. Surveyors sent to rechart the land reported 1 woman, a fence, and a stone house. When asked if she intended to leave, Mary replied, "I am not a settler. I am a receiver." What did she mean by that? A receiver of news? Of ships? Of silence? Her words were few, but deliberate. Historians later debated them. Some believed she had developed a philosophy, a kind of maritime monasticism, rooted in devotion. Others saw her as emblematic of the colonial erasure that occurred in so many regions. Promises of infrastructure withdrawn. People left to live in the shadow of maps that no longer included them. She never remarried. Never petitioned for Edward to be declared dead. Never sold the property. She paid her taxes in full, using fish oil and cured meat for barter. Once a year, she sent a letter, always the same format, always the same address, to any ship, carrying Captain Edward Wallace via Sydney. No letters were ever returned. By the time a group of provincial officials passed through in 1858, they found the structure well kept, the watchhouse full of tidy volumes. One visitor noted, "The ledger is dense with sea accounts. She logs by the moon, the birds, and a strange sense of time I cannot explain." Another remarked, "She speaks as if his return is assured. Not hopeful, not desperate, just inevitable." Some called it madness. Others, particularly mariners, called it faith. As for Edward Wallace, no official report ever named him lost. A merchant ship believed to have matched the Altona's dimensions was seen near the Solomon Islands in 1853, stripped for cargo, the crew unnamed. Another rumor placed him as a stowaway aboard a Dutch sugar hauler. But like so many men of that era, Edward Wallace drifted out of historical record into the silence between tides. And Mary Wallace? She remained. Asterisk, but in 1859, she made a single, uncharacteristic decision. She built a cairn at the edge of the bluff, not a grave, but a marker. A single plank placed upright in the soil bore the words, "Return route, unverified." Beneath it, she buried one item, Edward's last letter, asterisk, Y. Bury it then, and not before? What had shifted in her daily rhythm, in her inner calendar, to make her mark the ground after 8 silent years? Asterisk, what did it mean to lay to rest a letter, but not a life? Asterisk, where the shoreline ends in the early days of 1860, a boy named Elias, the son of a surveyor posted nearby, wandered down the trail to Whale Bay. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The widow of Whale Bay was local legend by then. He expected a ghost or a ruin. What he found instead was a small, upright woman mending a fishing net outside a house of stone. She offered him a piece of dry apple and asked no questions. Later he would say she reminded him of a lighthouse, not loud, not warm, but somehow steady. That boy became the last person known to see Mary Wallace alive. 2 weeks later, the flax trader Joseph Fenwick returned, the same man who had once spoken to Mary in the watch house years earlier. He had brought with him a gift, a bundle of linen from Sydney, wrapped around a new naval report. Inside it he had tucked a message copied from a harbor logbook, a note that a man named Edward Wallace had briefly been held at a colonial outpost hospital in 1852, disembarked due to fever. The ship had continued without him. The man had reportedly died of infection within a week, buried in an unmarked grave in northern Queensland. Asterisk, by the time Fenwick arrived, the house was empty. Asterisk, there were no signs of distress. The door was latched, but unlocked. The nets were folded. The firewood was stacked neatly. In the watch house, all the ledgers had been arranged in a single stack on the table, weighed down with a stone from the beach. The final entry read, "Barometer falling, no wind today. Fires will remain unlit. M.W." Locals searched the coastline, of course. It was a modest effort, a few fishermen, a constable from a nearby village. But no trace of Mary was ever found. Her boat was still tethered. Her coat still hung by the door. It was as if she had simply walked into the sea and let the tide decide. Asterisk, no one could say exactly why she chose that day, or if it was a choice at all. Some believed she had taken the news Fenwick brought as closure. Others thought she had known the truth long before and had simply waited for the world to catch up. And some, quietly, suggested that perhaps she hadn't disappeared at all, that she had simply stopped being noticed, the way the bay had once vanished from the maps. Asterisk, in the years that followed, sailors still recorded strange lights near Whale Bay, 3 faint flames, always in the same pattern, headland, rock, bluff. Even as the coastline changed and the sheep stations gave way to new roads, the lights were occasionally mentioned in passing logs, never confirmed, never explained. Asterisk, the watch house remained intact for nearly 2 decades. Children dared each other to enter until weather and time finally wore it down. The ledgers, however, were preserved, first by a local schoolteacher, then by a museum in Wellington. Today, they rest in a quiet archive, seldom displayed. Neatly written, meticulously dated, they span 8 years of tide notes, wind charts, and ship sightings. The records have been used by modern meteorologists to confirm past storm patterns. Oceanographers studying migratory currents once praised Mary Wallace's notes as accidentally scientific. Asterisk, but to most, her story remains obscure. A woman who waited. A ship that never came. A life shaped not by an event, but by the absence of one. Asterisk, yet if you stand at the edge of Whale Bay, on certain mornings when the sky is heavy and the sea sits still, you might still feel it, a presence, or maybe just a question. Not of ghosts or lost sailors, but of what it means to wait so long for something that the world forgets to deliver. Asterisk. Was Mary Wallace a figure of delusion, or was she the last person willing to believe in a promise the sea never confirmed? Did she truly believe Edward would return, or did she perhaps become the shoreline itself, something shaped endlessly by the thing it could not hold? Asterisk. And in a world full of unfinished voyages, which is harder to endure, the storm that ends the journey, or the calm that never does? Asterisk. The Postmaster's Watch. Delays, ink, and isolation, minus 1,877 Yukon Territory. Delays in the snow, the wind. Across the Yukon Plateau in 1877 did not howl, it scraped. It rasped through bare spruce and over frozen soil like a dull blade across bark, sound carried in strange ways in the far north. A voice could vanish at 10 paces while a cough could echo for miles. In this place, communication was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. And for a while, that lifeline had a name. Alfred Bremer. Bremer was not a man of legend. He never discovered gold or founded a town. But in a settlement so small, it was known only by its trading post designation, YP7 on the Hudson's Bay Records. Bremer was the one who sorted the mail. Or rather, who waited for the mail that never seemed to come. Asterisk. The settlement lay more than 200 miles from the nearest proper road, nestled between low hills and the frozen edge of a wide river that thawed only in July. There was no train, no telegraph, no carriage service. Just a monthly sled when weather allowed. Most months it did not. Asterisk. Alfred Bremer, originally from Schleswig-Holstein, had arrived in British Columbia in 1869 with vague dreams of fur trade fortune. Like many such men, he found more frost than finance. After several false starts, he accepted a low-paying, long-haul position with the Hudson's Bay Company. He was to oversee the YP7 outpost, a small depot meant to serve trappers, surveyors, and the occasional missionary. His tasks were simple: record inventory, keep the ledgers, and most crucially, manage the postal drop. Asterisk. But by 1875, mail delivery had begun to fail. The reason was partly geographic. Sled teams often couldn't reach the post through the ice-choked hills, and the one reliable courier had quit after a blizzard claimed 3 of his dogs. There was also a deeper, bureaucratic reason. The Hudson's Bay Company had begun to shift its focus toward the south, where expansion was more profitable and climate less punishing. Northern routes like YP-7 fell quietly out of funding, out of reach, and out of mind. Asterisk. Still, Bremer kept watch. Every Monday, at first light, he would hike 2 miles to the bluff that overlooked the narrow river pass. There, wrapped in wool and seal fur, he'd scan the white horizon for motion, a sled team, a figure, a flicker of change. He brought with him a wooden post with a small red flag. If he saw no courier, he planted it upright, visible to any passerby. On days when visibility was poor, he hoisted a black lantern instead. Asterisk. It was a strange ritual, and a lonely one. Asterisk. The logbooks from the outpost are sparse, but Bremer's notes are consistent. He kept a journal separate from the trade ledgers. His handwriting, small and exact, filled page after page with quiet observations. January 12th, wind from southeast, snowfall overnight, no mail. January 19th, elk passed the storehouse. Dog injured its paw, no mail. January 26th, dreamt of keel, awoke to silence, no mail. Each entry ended the same way. There were only 19 residents in YP-7, including 3 children. They lived in cabins spaced far apart, each with a stove, a sled, and enough pemmican and dried fish to last the season. For these settlers, news from the outside world was not merely curiosity. Letters told them whether a parent was dying, whether a brother had survived the voyage west, whether the war in Europe still raged. When the mail didn't arrive, it didn't just delay hope, it delayed decisions. Births went unrecorded. Deaths went UNACKNOWLED. By the spring of 1876, the community had begun to drift into a strange pattern of shared forgetting. They stopped asking Bremer if he'd seen the courier. They stopped writing letters altogether. What was the point? Of sending words that never left? One resident, a Metis woman named Claudine Baptiste, continued to bring her letters to Bremer every full moon. She never asked if they were sent. She just handed them over with a nod. Bremer dutifully stored them in a leather pouch marked "Outbound." That summer, no mail arrived at all. When the river thawed in July, Bremer took a canoe and paddled 18 miles to the next nearest depot. There, a junior trader explained, with a shrug, that the courier contract for YP-7 had been suspended, pending reevaluation of resource efficiency. In other words, the company didn't want to spend money reaching a handful of isolated settlers in a place that produced neither furs nor revenue. Bremer returned with a single sack of mail. It had been sitting in a storeroom for months. When he handed out the letters, many were unopened. Some recipients had already moved away. One letter, addressed to a man named Piers, was postmarked March, a birth announcement. But Piers had died in May, during an accident with a frozen stream crossing. Bremer buried the letter beside the cabin. By winter, Bremer had taken to lighting a fire at the bluff each week. A way to signal, to whom, it was never entirely clear. But he kept at it. As snow fell deeper and temperatures dropped below -30°C, the bluff fire became a fixture in the landscape. Some said it looked like a misplaced star. Others didn't notice it at all. And still, Bremer recorded it. December 10th. Snowdrift. Near West Fence, no mail. Bluff fire lit at 6:04 a.m. December 17th. Claudine brought a letter. Her son has begun to forget his grandfather's face. No mail. December 24th. Wind like knives. Pine snapped near depot. No mail. Bluff fire. Maintained. That Christmas, Bremer built a small table from discarded crates and left a package of stale biscuits at each cabin. He signed the notes, "Your postmaster." Most did not reply. But on New Year's Day, someone left him a sealed envelope with no writing, only a pressed sprig of cedar inside. Something was unraveling in Bremer that winter. Not madness exactly, but something close to it. The quiet was beginning to echo. The mailbag stayed empty, but his journal grew thicker. His entries became more reflective, even poetic. January 14th. A silence so wide it cannot be walked. The sky is a curtain that never lifts. I am still here, no mail. By March of 1877, Hudson's Bay officially closed the YP-7 outpost. Bremer received the news secondhand from a missionary passing through. There would be no resupply, no spring. Courier. The depot was to be shuttered. Bremer was expected to leave. He didn't. Instead, he placed a sign on the storehouse door. Outpost closed. Postmaster still present. But what does it mean to be a postmaster when there is no post to master? When messages no longer pass through and senders no longer believe in receivers? What role remains for the man who waits beside the trail no one travels? The weight of letters, the closure of the YP-7 outpost in early 1877 should have marked the end of Alfred Bremer's responsibilities. The Hudson's Bay Company had, in its typically spare phrasing, advised, vacate premises, retain remaining goods for transfer, abandon non-essential duties. The word non-essential must have stung. But Bremer, in his solitude, had long since stopped viewing his post in terms of employment. To him, the depot was no longer a place of business. It was a location for memory and the mail. a collection of unrealized hopes that still deserved their ritual. He did not leave. Instead, he gathered the remaining provisions, tins of flour, pemmican, kerosene, and a half-used crate of tallow candles, and sorted them into seasonal bundles. His journal from February 1877 begins a new pattern. Inventory tallies cross-referenced with personal observations. Now, each day's note began with temperature, snowfall estimate, and food supply status. Only then did he mark the absence of mail, almost as an afterthought. February 9th, -23°C at dawn. Flour at 6 measures, 1 candle finished, no mail. February 14th, sun visible for 38 minutes. Claudine brought dried fish. I gave her 2 letters to post, knowing she has nowhere to post them. No mail. Bremer had become a postmaster to ghosts. He still lit the bluff fire. It had grown. Smaller, more symbolic than practical. Sometimes it didn't catch. Sometimes he didn't try. But most weeks, he walked the 2 miles through wind-packed snow, stood at the edge of the bluff, and stared at the silent trail that once brought messages. He never stopped believing that someone might still come through it. Or at least he pretended to believe. A small act of resistance against being forgotten. In early spring, Claudine Baptiste came to visit. She had become, by then, the last family still living near the depot. The rest had either returned south, fallen ill, or drifted to new posts further west. She found Bremer rebinding an old trade log into a ledger of his own, transforming the columns once meant for pelts and prices into lines of poetry. She didn't comment on it. She simply left him a packet of birch bark and quietly sat by the fire. When she left, she took with her a stack of outbound letters. She would never send them. The nearest post was weeks away by sled. But she carried them anyway. Out of shared courtesy. There is something solemn in the act of holding someone else's forgotten hopes. As the thaw arrived in late May, the land changed, trees budded. The ice in the river groaned and cracked open. Birds returned, but Bremer's routine remained fixed. He no longer lauded the weather for anyone but himself, and the dates grew less precise. One page simply read, June, 3rd or 4th week, bright. Air wet, dreams of voices. 1 letter burned to save ink. Bremer had begun to use ash and water as substitute ink. His script turned pale gray. His observations took on a drifting tone, sometimes metaphysical, sometimes oddly practical. A letter is only a thought that dressed itself and walked to a door. If no door opens, does the letter still matter? He began binding his journals into parcels. One was labeled, Letters to No One. Another, Seasonal Silence. He sealed each bundle with wax and stored them in a chest made from broken supply crates. What exactly he expected to happen to these writings remains unclear. But Bremer seemed more preoccupied with preservation than communication. As if the act of writing, of documenting the stillness, could itself be an answer. It wasn't. Just letters he kept. In the depot's loft, he had amassed what he called the waiting shelf. A child's carved toy, a silver spoon, a set of moccasins meant for a newborn. All items left at the depot by hopeful hands, things people asked him to pass along whenever the mail next arrived. He never discarded them. They sat there, gathering dust but never doubt. But even Alfred Bremer had limits. By midsummer, he began writing fewer entries. Pages were dated only by the phase of the moon. His language grew spare. There were still no visitors. Claudine Baptiste's family had moved further downriver in search of better fishing. The last man Bremer saw was a prospector who passed by. In early July, heading north, he left behind a can of beans and a crumpled newspaper dated January. Bremer read it several times before burning it for warmth. His final journal, bound and stitched, Rabbit Hide, contains one of the most quietly Arresting entries in Northern Canadian archive history. It is written with thick, faltering lines, possibly in charcoal. I waited. I watched. If anyone should come here again, know this. The mail was not lost, only misplaced by time. There is a difference. Asterisk, he signed it, as always, Postmaster. YP-7. Asterisk, when a new expedition passed through the area in 1879, the depot was boarded but intact. Inside, they found his journals, the bundled letters, and a single chair placed beside the window. There was no body, only an impression in the seat, as if someone had just stepped away. Asterisk, Bremer's writings now reside in the Dawson Historical Archives. They are rarely viewed, mostly because they appear, at a glance, to be the mutterings of a man too long alone. But if read closely, they reveal something else, a detailed, layered meditation on what it means to be entrusted with the words of others, even when there is no one left to receive them. Asterisk, in a world of vanished posts and discontinued routes. Bremer reminds us that the weight of a letter does not come from the paper, but from the hope it carries, and from the quiet, faithful hands that hold it steady while the world forgets. Asterisk, but was Bremer truly forgotten? Or is it possible that he, like Mary Wallace in Whale Bay, became something more enduring than memory, a sentinel not of messages delivered, but of meaning kept? Asterisk, lost roots, kept promises. When the expedition from Dawson finally reopened the YP-7 depot in 1879, they expected the kind of decay typical in abandoned northern posts, collapsed beams, looted supplies, and wildlife reclamation. Instead, they found something almost unnerving in its order. The storehouse was intact. The supply room was catalogued, with entries dating through mid-1878. Even the hearth had been swept. No chaos, no clutter. Just silence, tidily filed away. Asterisk, the chest of letters sat against the back wall beneath a piece of oilcloth. Inside, 32 letters bundled in twine, dated, folded, and sealed. Some addressed to names that no longer matched any known settler lists. A few bore no names at all, simply marked, to be forwarded when possible. The postmaster's final message lay tucked among them, and in its clarity, it read less like a farewell than a handover, as though he had stepped aside only temporarily, expecting another custodian to pick up where he left off. Asterisk, but no one ever did. Asterisk, the YP-7 depot was officially decommissioned by the Hudson's Bay Company that year. The mail pouch was forwarded to Fort Simpson, where most of it was eventually lost to fire. A few letters survive in the Dawson archives today, one from a mother in Victoria to her daughter, urging her not to marry the trapper with bad boots and worse intentions. Another from a man in Montreal asking whether his brother's land had yielded any harvest. The rest are fragmentary, charred, or missing. Asterisk, as for Alfred Bremer, no formal death certificate exists. He is listed in Hudson's Bay ledgers only as unretrieved employee, presumed perished. His journals, however, tell a more nuanced story, not of disappearance, but of deliberate stillness. He had not vanished into the wilderness. He had embedded himself into it, slowly and without spectacle. Asterisk, a researcher in the 1960s, after reviewing Bremer's papers, coined the phrase postal liminality to describe the state he inhabited. No longer a functioning postmaster, not yet a historical figure. Just a man suspended between delivery and receipt, between silence and anticipation. A placeholder not just for mail, but for meaning. Asterisk, today, the site of YP-7 is little more than a moss-covered clearing by a bend in the river. A rusted stove remains. Some winter-hardened settlers claim you can still see markings on the trees. Not carvings, but scorch marks, perhaps from the bluff fire Bremer tended year after year. Whether it's true or not hardly matters. The story, like all stories in the quiet North, survives more in tone than in evidence. Asterisk, at a postal museum in Whitehorse, There's a small display titled The Postmaster Who Waited. It contains a replica of Bremer's ledger, a map of the failed courier routes, and a reproduction of one of his final journal entries. There are few things lonelier than unreceived words. Yet I kept them warm, in case. Children pass it quickly. Most adults linger briefly, confused by the lack of resolution. No heroic rescue, no reunion, no tragedy to mark the ending. Just a man who waited, then stopped waiting, then quietly stepped away. And yet one might ask, what is a postmaster really? Is he merely someone who delivers and collects, or does his true purpose lie in the quiet belief that someone, somewhere, still wishes to hear and be heard? That even in absence, even when routes vanish and maps fail, there remains value in holding space for connection? In a world where messages are instant and rarely remembered, Alfred Bremer's quiet duty feels oddly radical, a reminder that some things are worth preserving, even when no one is looking. That not all closures come with doors slamming shut. Some just fade, like footprints in thawing snow. So perhaps the question is not why Alfred Bremer waited, but why we stopped sending letters like the ones he kept.